On July 11th, 1302, outside the walls of Court and Flanders, the greatest army of French knights ever assembled prepared to crush what they saw as a rabble of dirty peasants and shopkeepers. The French cavalry gleamed in the morning sun, 500 mounted nobles in the finest armor money could buy, their golden spurs marking their status as the ultimate warriors of medieval Europe. Facing them stood 900 Flemish commoners, weavers, butchers, farmers, and craftsmen who had never attended a tournament or learned the rules of chivalry. By sunset, 1000 French nobles would be dead, their golden spurs ripped from their corpses as trophies, their blood soaking into Flemish mud. This is the story of how medieval Europe's untouchable warrior class discovered that a well-placed ditch and a spiked club could destroy centuries of military superiority. The battle's roots lay in an event so shocking that contemporaries called it the Matins of Bruges, a massacre that occurred 2 months earlier on May 18th, 1302. The Flemish had been under French occupation, with French garrisons treating Flemish citizens like conquered slaves. That morning, at the Matins bell dawn prayers, Flemish rebels led by Peter Donnic swept through Bruges with a simple test. Anyone who couldn't properly pronounce the Flemish phrase shield, invend, shield, and friend was immediately killed. French speakers, unable to pronounce the guttural Flemish sounds, were slaughtered in their beds. Over 20 French soldiers and sympathizers were murdered before breakfast. The streets of Bruges ran red with French blood, and when King Philip Roman IV, the Fair of France, heard the news, he swore to exterminate every Flemish citizen as punishment. The army Philip sent to Flanders was the most powerful force medieval France had ever fielded. Led by Count Robert Roman II of Artois, it included 2,500 mounted knights and squires, the cream of French nobility. These weren't just soldiers, but the rulers of France, dukes, counts, barons, and their sons, each wearing armor worth more than a Flemish craftsman would earn in a lifetime. Their horses alone represented generations of selective breeding, massive destriers trained from birth for war. The infantry numbered 5,500, including Genoese crossbowmen, the most feared missile troops in Europe. French knights had dominated European battlefields for 300 years. They had crushed peasant rebellions without breaking a sweat. In their minds, this wouldn't be a battle, but an execution. The Flemish army that assembled to meet this threat was revolutionary in its composition. Led by William of Ulick and Guy of Namur, it consisted almost entirely of urban militia, guild members who had learned to fight not in castle courtyards but in city streets. The weavers of Ghent, the butchers of Bruges, the fishmongers of Dam, men who worked with their hands and had calluses to prove it. They couldn't afford horses or full-plate armor. Most wore simple mail hallworks or padded gambersons, many just leather aprons from their trades. But they had something the French didn't expect: absolute desperation. They knew that defeat meant not just death, but the extermination of their families, their cities razed, their culture erased. They had nowhere to retreat to. This was their land, and they would die where they stood. The Flemish brought to the field a weapon that would help destroy the age of chivalry. The good dag, literally meaning good day in Flemish. This brutal instrument was essentially a heavy wooden shaft, 5 ft long, topped with an iron spike, combining the crushing power of a club with the penetration of a spear. In the hands of a strong man who spent his days hauling cargo or working a loom, it could crush a helmet like an egg or punch through mail armor. But the good andag's true power wasn't just physical. It was psychological. This was a peasant weapon requiring no years of training, no expensive materials, no noble bloodline. Any man with strong arms and rage in his heart could use it to kill a knight who had trained for war since childhood. The Flemish chose their battlefield with brilliant tactical awareness, positioning themselves on a plain near Courtrai between the Lace River and the Grotebeek stream. But here's what made them revolutionary. They transformed the battlefield before the French arrived. Working through the night of July 10th, they dug hidden ditches and trenches across the fields where cavalry would charge. These weren't visible from a distance. Covered with brush and grass, they were death traps for charging horses. The streams and marshes on their flanks meant the French couldn't outflank them. The Flemish formed their battle line in a dense formation, presenting a forest of pikes and goedendags, with the militia of each city grouped together. Bruges Gent, their guild banners flying above them like a medieval corporation, ready for hostile takeover. When Count Robert of Artois arrived and saw the Flemish position, his nobles actually laughed. These peasants had no cavalry. In medieval military thinking, this meant they had no army. They were infantry, and infantry existed to be ridden down by knights. Some French nobles proposed using their crossbowmen to thin the Flemish ranks first, but Robert refused, declaring it would be shameful to let commoners kill other commoners when nobles were present. To claim the glory, he reportedly said, "Should we let merchants' blood stain our swords when we could simply ride them down like wheat?" The French knights demanded the honor of the first charge. They saw not an enemy army, but a collection of rebels to be executed. The very idea that shopkeepers could stand against them was an insult to the natural order of the universe. At noon on July 11th, the French cavalry began their charge. 2,500 horses accelerated across the field, the ground shaking under tons of steel and horse flesh. The knights lowered their lances, each one choosing a specific Flemish citizen to skewer. The Flemish stood absolutely still, not a man breaking formation, their pikes and goedags held steady. Then, 50 yards from impact, disaster struck. The first line of French cavalry hit the hidden ditches. Horses screamed as their legs snapped, catapulting knights forward into the mud. The second line, unable to stop, crashed into the first. The third line piled into the second. Within seconds, the magnificent charge had become a writhing mass of broken horses and trapped knights. Men in 60 lb of armor, drowning in muddy ditches they couldn't escape from. The Flemish line surged forward like a wave of unleashed hatred. The guild militiamen fell upon the trapped French knights with their goedags, and what followed was less battle than industrial slaughter. The spiked clubs rose and fell in rhythm, the weavers of Gent working in unison as they had at their looms, the butchers of Bruges applying their trade to new materials. French knights, trapped under dead horses or stuck in mud, could only raise their arms to ward off blows that crush through steel like it was parchment. The sound, chroniclers wrote, was like 1,000 blacksmiths working at once, the continuous ring and crunch of metal being destroyed. Knights who had never felt fear in their lives screamed for mercy in languages the Flemish didn't understand or chose not to hear. Those French knights who avoided the ditches met the Flemish pike wall and discovered that courage meant nothing against mathematics. The Flemish pikes were 12 to 18 ft long, meaning the French had to survive through multiple ranks of pike points before they could even reach an enemy with their swords. Horses, no matter how well trained, wouldn't impale themselves on walls of spikes. They reared through their riders, turned sideways, creating more chaos. Knights who tried to push through on foot found themselves facing not individual combat, but a machine of coordinated death. The Flemish didn't fight as heroes, but as a unit. When one man's pike broke, he stepped back and another took his place. It was proto-industrial warfare, treating killing as a communal craft rather than personal glory. Count Robert of Artois himself led a final desperate charge, trying to break the Flemish center. He actually penetrated several ranks deep, his sword cutting down militiamen before a Bruges butcher named Willem van Sefting knocked him from his horse with a good blow that caved in his helmet. Robert was then methodically beaten to death by multiple Flemish craftsmen, his expensive armor merely prolonging his agony. Around him died the greatest names of French nobility: Jacques de Haitian, governor of F. Anders, Godfrey of Brabant, John I, Count of Aumale, G. the Furs of Clement, and 68 other titled nobles. Never in medieval history had so much blue blood soaked into common soil. The Flemish showed no respect for rank. A duke died as easily as a squire when a Gudenag crushed his skull. As the French army collapsed and fled, leaving their dead and wounded behind, the Flemish began their harvest. They stripped the corpses methodically, but it wasn't the armor or weapons they prized most. It was the golden spurs. These spurs were the ultimate symbol of knighthood, awarded when a squire became a knight, worn as badges of military and social superiority. The Flemish cut them from corpses with their work knives, the same knives they used to cut cloth or butcher meat. By evening, they had collected over 700 pairs of golden spurs. Some militiamen wore multiple pairs on their belts as trophies. Others nailed them to their workshop walls. The spurs were hung in the church of Our Lady in Court like a chandelier of humiliation, where they remained for decades as testimony to the day shopkeepers destroyed chivalry. The scale of French losses was so unprecedented that counting the dead became a political problem. French sources initially tried to minimize the disaster, claiming only 300 knights died. But Flemish sources, backed by church records of funeral masses, put the noble dead at over 1,000, with total French casualties approaching 2,000. The bodies were so numerous that they couldn't be buried properly. Many were thrown into mass graves, knights and squires mixed together without ceremony. Noble families across France went into mourning simultaneously. Widows who had sent their husbands and sons to crush peasants received back only blood-stained golden spurs if they were lucky. Some bodies were so mutilated by Gudenags that identification was impossible. The cream of French chivalry had been turned into unrecognizable meat. Flemish casualties were astoundingly light, perhaps 100 dead, mostly from the initial crossbow exchange before the charge. The militiamen could hardly believe what they had accomplished. Weavers, who that morning had expected death, were now wearing knights' cloaks. Butchers were trying on noble swords. Children ran through the battlefield, collecting arrows as souvenirs. The psychological impact was even greater than the military victory. These weren't professional soldiers. They were citizens who would return to their shops and guilds with the knowledge that they had destroyed the myth of noble invincibility. In taverns across Flanders, craftsmen would drink from cups made from French knights' helmets. The battlefield became a pilgrimage site where common people came to see where their kind had proven that birth meant less than courage. When news of the disaster reached Paris, King Philip Roman IV initially refused to believe it. When confirmation arrived, he flew into such a rage that courtiers feared for their lives. The idea that merchants and craftsmen had destroyed the flower of French knighthood was more than a military defeat. It was an assault on the divine order of society. The Church struggled to explain how God had allowed commoners to triumph over their social superiors. Some priests claimed the French had been punished for their sins, others that the devil had aided the Flemish. The French began spreading propaganda that the Flemish had used dishonorable tricks, that they had poisoned the field, that they had made pacts with demons. Anything was more acceptable than admitting peasants had simply outfought knights. The Battle of the Golden Spurs should have changed medieval warfare forever. But the aristocratic system was too entrenched to die from one defeat. The French returned with armies in 1304 and 1328, adapting their tactics, using more crossbowmen, avoiding direct charges into prepared positions. The Flemish, trying to repeat their success, were eventually defeated at the Battle of Cassel in 1328. But something fundamental had shifted. The invincibility of heavy cavalry was broken. Across Europe, peasant revolts increased, inspired by Courtrai. The English would adopt similar tactics at Sai and Ancre. The age of the citizen soldier, though still centuries away, had been glimpsed. The golden spurs hanging in Court's church were a promise that the age of aristocratic domination would eventually end. The good and dug became a symbol of resistance across Europe. Peasant revolts from England to Germany adopted similar weapons, simple, brutal, effective tools that required strength rather than skill. The Swiss would perfect this concept with their halberd, the English with their billhook, the Czechs with their flails. These weren't noble weapons with names and histories, but democratic instruments of death that any strong man could wield. Blacksmiths across Europe began producing them in secret, hidden in barns and cellars. The aristocracy tried to ban them, declaring them unknightly and dishonorable. But you can't ban a weapon that can be made from a farming tool. The Godendag had proven that the monopoly on violence was breaking. The battle's impact on medieval culture was profound. French literature, which had celebrated knightly prowess, suddenly had to explain how heroes could be beaten to death by shopkeepers. The entire concept of the three estates, those who fight, those who pray, those who work, was called into question. If those who work could fight better than those who fight, what was the point of the nobility? Flemish culture exploded with pride. Songs were written, paintings commissioned, plays performed, all celebrating the day common men proved their worth. The French tried to suppress these celebrations, but every attempted vengeance only reinforced the narrative. The golden spurs became holy relics of class warfare, each one representing a dead oppressor. In the immediate aftermath of the battle, Flemish militia hunted down French survivors hiding in the countryside. Wounded knights who had crawled from the field were killed with the same clubs used to slaughter cattle. Some French nobles offered massive ransoms, but the Flemish weren't interested in money. They wanted French blood. Bodies floated down the Lys River for days. Peasants found French knights hiding in haystacks, in churches, in pig pens, and beat them to death with whatever tools were handy. It wasn't chivalrous, it wasn't honorable, but it was justice to people who had been treated like animals by their social betters. The systematic killing continued for 3 days until no French noble remained alive in Flanders. The city of Ghent held a victory celebration that became legendary in its excess. The militiamen paraded through the streets wearing captured French armor that didn't fit, dragging noble banners in the mud, displaying golden spurs like merchant wares. They held mock tournaments where weavers pretending to be knights fought with exaggerated incompetence, mocking the rituals of chivalry. French prisoners, the few non-nobles taken alive, were forced to watch as Flemish children played with their masters' swords. Prostitutes wore countesses' dresses. The social order wasn't just defeated. It was deliberately inverted and mocked. The celebration lasted 3 days and ended with a massive bonfire of French banners, while the militia sang songs about the cowardice of nobles who couldn't even die properly. Beyond the military triumph, the Battle of the Golden Spurs secured Flemish economic independence. The Flemish cloth industry, the richest in Europe, had been under threat of French control. Victory meant that Bruges, Ghent, and Pries could continue their trade without French interference or taxation. The gold and equipment stripped from French corpses provided capital for expanded production. Flemish merchants could negotiate as equals with kings, knowing their cities had militias that could destroy royal armies. The battle proved that economic power could translate into military power without aristocratic intermediaries. The modern concept of the citizen soldier defending commercial interests rather than feudal obligations was born in Flemish blood and French mud. King Philip Roman IV spent the next 2 years obsessing over revenge for Courtrai. He raised new armies, imposed crushing taxes, and borrowed from Italian bankers to fund his vendetta against Flanders. The French developed new tactics, specifically to counter Flemish militia. More disciplined use of crossbowmen, dismounted knights fighting as heavy infantry, and careful reconnaissance to avoid terrain traps. But the psychological damage was permanent. French knights would never again charge with the absolute confidence they had shown that morning at Courtrai. The knowledge that death could come from a commoner's club, rather than noble sword, changed how they approached battle. Some historians argue that French military conservatism for the next century stemmed from the trauma of Courtrai. The golden spurs remained hanging in the Church of Our Lady in court for 80 years, until Philip, the Good of Burgundy, finally had them removed in 1382. But by then their symbolic work was done. Every Flemish child knew the story. Every French noble knew the shame. When the spurs were taken, the Flemish immediately created replicas and hung those instead. The date July 11th became a Flemish national holiday that is still celebrated today in Belgium. The battlefield itself became sacred ground where Flemish patriots would swear oaths. Even during World War I, Belgian troops drew inspiration from Courtrai, seeing themselves as modern Flemish militia fighting foreign invaders. The battle had transcended history to become myth. Modern military historians study court as a pivotal moment in the evolution of warfare. The Flemish victory demonstrated combined arms tactics centuries before the term existed. Obstacles, ditches, missile weapons, crossbows, and heavy infantry, pikemen, working in coordination. They proved that discipline and preparation could overcome individual martial prowess. The battle showed that terrain preparation was as important as courage. Most importantly, it demonstrated that motivated citizen militia defending their homeland could defeat professional military aristocrats. Every successful revolution, from the Swiss independence to the American Revolution, owes something to the Flemish militiamen who stood their ground that July morning. The battle accelerated military technological development across Europe. Armor became heavier and more elaborate to protect against weapons like the guerdon dug, which ironically made knights even more vulnerable to being trapped. Weapons designed specifically to counter heavy armor proliferated: warhammers, military picks, and specialized polearms. The arms race between armor and armor-defeating weapons intensified, but technology couldn't solve the fundamental problem exposed. Expensive individual warriors could be defeated by cheap collective force. The mathematics of warfare had changed, and knights' equipment cost enough to arm dozens of militiamen. And those dozens would win every time if properly organized. While Courtrai didn't immediately overthrow feudalism, it planted seeds that would grow for centuries. Guilds across Europe gained military confidence, demanding greater political rights backed by the implicit threat of violence. City militias became power brokers in medieval politics. The bourgeoisie, the merchant middle class, learned they could defend themselves without aristocratic protection. Urban centers grew more independent from rural noble control. The battle contributed to the rise of city-states and urban republics. When common craftsmen could kill noble warriors, the fundamental justification for aristocracy protection in exchange for obedience began to crumble. Like all great battles, court accumulated legends over time. The number of golden spurs supposedly grew with each telling from 500 to 700 to some accounts claiming 1,000. Stories emerged of individual Flemish heroes performing impossible feats like a single weaver killing 20 knights. The French dead became more numerous and noble with each generation's retelling, but archaeological evidence from the battlefield confirms the essential truth. A massive French cavalry force was destroyed by Flemish infantry. Excavations have found concentrations of horseshoes in the ditch areas, broken weapons consistent with Gurdon impacts, and enough French military equipment to confirm a major defeat. The legend, for once, doesn't exceed the reality. Often overlooked in accounts of the battle were the Flemish women who played crucial support roles. They brought water to the militia during the fight, dragged wounded Flemings from danger, and most brutally helped finish off wounded French knights. Chroniclers describe women using rocks and agricultural tools to kill trapped nobles, venting generations of oppression. After the battle, they stripped the dead with professional efficiency, knowing the value of every piece of equipment. Some women wore captured noble jewelry to market for years afterward, a deliberate provocation to any French sympathizers. The wives of dead militiamen received shares of the plunder, creating an early form of military widow's pension. The battle wasn't just won by men, but by an entire community united in resistance. The Battle of the Golden Spurs taught a lesson that took centuries to fully understand. Military power flows from economic and social organization, not from bloodline or individual prowess. The Flemish cities had developed sophisticated guild structures, economic networks, and civic institutions that could mobilize and coordinate thousands of citizens. Their victory wasn't a fluke, but the logical result of superior organization meeting obsolete military tradition. The French nobility trapped in their chivalry world. You couldn't understand how merchants and craftsmen had acquired military capability. They kept looking for the trick, the deception, the dishonor that must explain their defeat, never realizing that the world had changed and they had become anachronisms. The Battle of the Golden Spurs resonates through history as one of the great democratic military victories. When Swiss peasants defeated Austrian knights at Morgarten in 1315, they knew about courtry. When English longbow bowmen destroyed French chivalry at Sai in 1346, they had learned from Flemish example. When American colonists faced British regulars, the spirit of courtry was there, citizens defeating professionals. The golden spurs taken as trophies became symbols of every moment when the oppressed proved they could fight back. In 1302, on a muddy field in Anders, the age of aristocratic military monopoly received its death blow from a spiked club wielded by a weaver's calloused hands. The modern world, where citizenship rather than birth determines military service, began with Flemish craftsmen standing firm against a charge they weren't supposed to survive.
Save.